That part of Vermont had always felt older than it should. Not ancient, exactly. Just forgotten. The roads narrowed as they climbed into the mountains. The trees grew thicker, closer together. And once the sun started going down, the entire forest seemed to absorb the light around it. Locals around Bennington had a habit of speaking carefully about those woods. Not dramatically. Not like they were trying to tell ghost stories. If anything, it was the opposite. Most people preferred not to talk about the mountain at all, especially Glastenbury Mountain. By the 1940s, the area already had a strange reputation. There had once been a small logging town deep in those woods. Families lived there for years, cutting timber and working the mountain through brutal winters. But eventually, people started leaving, one by one. The railroad stopped running. Businesses disappeared. Homes were abandoned. And before long, the town itself was practically gone. Nature moved back in quietly. Roads vanished beneath weeds. Foundations disappeared under moss. And the forest reclaimed almost everything. But even after the town faded away, stories about the mountain didn't. Hunters talked about hearing strange sounds deep in the woods. Hikers described the unsettling feeling of being watched. Some claimed compasses behaved strangely there. Others said the forest became unnaturally quiet at certain points along the trails. Most of those stories were impossible to verify. And honestly, many people dismissed them entirely. Because isolated mountains create isolated imaginations. And when people get lost in the wilderness, fear has a way of filling in the blanks. Still, there was something about Glastenbury that lingered in people's minds. Something difficult to explain, especially after the disappearances began. Because once they started, they didn't stop. And the first person to vanish was a man who knew those woods better than almost anyone else. In November of 1945, a 74-year-old hunting guide named Mitty Rivers stepped into the woods near Glastenbury Mountain with a small group of hunters. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. Mitty was quiet, experienced, practical, the kind of man who had spent most of his life outdoors. He knew the forests around southern Vermont better than almost anyone else. For years, he had guided hunters through those mountains during deer season. He knew the trails, the ridges, the streams, and more importantly, he knew how dangerous those woods could become once the weather changed. That afternoon, the group had been returning from a hunting trip near Long Trail Road. The sun was already beginning to drop behind the mountains, and temperatures were falling quickly. So Mitty took the lead. That was normal. He walked slightly ahead of the others, guiding them back toward camp, while the hunters followed behind carrying their gear. According to the group later, nothing seemed wrong. No arguments, no panic, no sign Mitty planned to leave the trail. At one point, the men behind him briefly stopped near a small stream. It only lasted a moment. But when they looked back up the trail again, Mitty was gone. At first, nobody panicked. The woods were thick, and it wasn't unusual to lose sight of someone for a few seconds. So the hunters called out his name. Once, then again. Nothing answered back. No footsteps. No movement in the brush. No voice. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees. The men spread out and searched the immediate area, expecting to find Mitty just beyond the trail. Maybe he had stepped off briefly. Maybe he'd fallen. Maybe he was playing some kind of joke. But after several minutes, they realized something was seriously wrong. Mitty Rivers had vanished in a section of forest he knew better than his own backyard. And somehow, there wasn't a single obvious trace of where he had gone. By nightfall, search teams began moving into the mountain. And very quickly, the disappearance stopped looking like an ordinary missing person case. The search began almost immediately. At first, the hunters assumed Mitty had simply lost his footing somewhere off the trail. Maybe he'd slipped into a ravine. Maybe he was injured and unable to call back. That kind of accident wasn't unheard of in the mountains, especially in November. But as more people arrived to help search the area, a troubling detail became impossible to ignore. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken branches. No dropped equipment. No blood. Nothing. And that made very little sense. Because Mitty Rivers was not an inexperienced hiker wandering unfamiliar woods. He was a professional outdoorsman. At 74 years old, he had spent decades navigating forests exactly like this one. If he was hurt, he would have known how to leave markers behind. If he was lost, he would have known how to retrace his steps. And if something had frightened him badly enough to run, searchers believed they would have seen evidence of it somewhere in the terrain. But they found none. As daylight faded, temperatures dropped sharply across the mountain. The wind strengthened, and the forest became harder to navigate with every passing hour. Still, search crews continued combing the woods through the night using lanterns and flashlights. They searched trails, creek beds, dense patches of pine. At times, volunteers formed long human chains and walked shoulder to shoulder through the trees, trying to make sure nothing was missed. But the mountain seemed to absorb everything. Sound disappeared quickly out there. Voices echoed strangely between the trees. And after dark, visibility collapsed almost completely. Some members of the search later admitted the forest felt unsettling at night. Not haunted, not supernatural. Just oppressive. As though the deeper they moved into the woods, the quieter everything became. Then another strange detail surfaced. One of the hunters claimed that shortly before Mitty vanished, he had turned around briefly to check on the group. And according to that hunter, Mitty looked concerned about something farther ahead on the trail. No one knew what he might have seen, because seconds later, he was gone. Over the next several days, the search expanded far beyond the original trail. More volunteers arrived from nearby towns. Experienced woodsmen joined the effort. State investigators began coordinating organized sweeps through the mountain terrain. By then, everyone understood the same thing. If Mitty Rivers was still alive, time was running out. The conditions in the mountains had become brutal. Nighttime temperatures dropped below freezing, and cold rain moved through the area almost constantly. The ground turned slick and unstable. In some places, thick fog rolled through the forest so heavily that searchers could barely see a few yards ahead. And yet, despite all the people combing through the wilderness, investigators still could not explain how a man like Mitty Rivers had disappeared so completely. They searched the nearby streams in case he had fallen into fast-moving water. Nothing. They checked hunting cabins and abandoned structures scattered through the woods. Nothing. Tracking dogs were eventually brought into the area, but according to reports from the time, the dogs struggled to maintain a reliable scent trail. At certain points, the trail simply seemed to end. That detail would later become one of the most repeated parts of the story, not because it proved anything supernatural, but because it deepened the mystery. People familiar with wilderness searches knew that losing a scent trail could happen for many reasons. Weather, terrain, water movement. Still, the absence of evidence began affecting the local community in a very real way. Because the deeper the search teams pushed into Glastenbury Mountain, the less sense the case seemed to make. Eventually, investigators reached a difficult conclusion. Mitty Rivers had likely died somewhere in the wilderness. But even after days of searching, they could not find his body, or his rifle, or even a single clear sign showing where he had gone. And slowly, the mood around the mountain began to change. What started as concern turned into unease, because people realized something disturbing. A man who knew those woods better than almost anyone alive had entered the forest, and somehow, the forest had kept him. Almost exactly 1 year later, the mountain took someone else. This time, the disappearance would capture national attention. On the afternoon of December 1st, 1946, an 18-year-old college student named Paula Weldon left her campus at Bennington College and started walking toward the mountains. At the time, nothing about her behavior appeared unusual. She wasn't running away. She hadn't gotten into trouble. And according to friends, she seemed completely normal that day. Paula was intelligent, quiet, and independent. Originally from Connecticut, she came from a well-respected family and had adjusted well to college life in Vermont. People who knew her later described her as thoughtful and mature, not reckless, not impulsive. That Sunday afternoon, she told friends she planned to go for a hike. It wasn't uncommon. The area around Bennington was filled with scenic trails, especially during late autumn, when the mountains became covered in fading reds and golds. But winter was already beginning to settle into Vermont. Temperatures were dropping fast, and sunset came early in the mountains. Before leaving campus, Paula changed into more practical clothes for walking outdoors. Most witnesses remembered one detail very clearly. She was wearing a bright red coat. At some point during the afternoon, several people reported seeing her heading toward the long trail near Glastenbury Mountain. One couple later told investigators they had passed Paula on the trail while hiking. According to them, she appeared calm, maybe slightly tired, but not distressed. That sighting would become extremely important later, because as far as investigators could determine, it was one of the last confirmed moments anyone ever saw Paula Weldon alive. As evening approached, temperatures dropped sharply across the mountains. And back at the college, people slowly began realizing Paula had not returned. At first, nobody panicked. An overdue student didn't automatically mean danger. But as the night continued, concerns started turning into something else. Because Paula Weldon was responsible, careful, and according to those closest to her, disappearing without telling anyone simply wasn't like her. Then morning came, and Paula was still missing. By late December, Paula Weldon's disappearance had become one of the biggest stories in the country. Newspapers from New York to Chicago carried updates about the missing college student in the red coat. And with every passing day, the mystery only deepened. Investigators continued receiving reported sightings from across the Northeast. Some people claimed Paula had been seen boarding buses. Others insisted they saw her walking along remote roads in nearby states. One witness even believed she was hiding in Massachusetts under a different name. But none of the reports could ever be confirmed. Meanwhile, search teams kept returning to the mountain. Even after weeks of failure, many volunteers refused to give up completely, because emotionally, the case felt impossible to accept. An 18-year-old student could not simply vanish in broad daylight without leaving behind some kind of trace. At least that's what people wanted to believe. But winter conditions were becoming increasingly dangerous. Snow began covering sections of trail. Ice formed along steep ridges and wooded slopes. And as the weather worsened, the chances of finding Paula alive dropped sharply. Eventually, organized searches started slowing down. Not because people stopped caring, but because investigators were running out of places to look. The mountain had already consumed thousands of search hours, and still, it remained silent. For many residents around Bennington, that silence became the most disturbing part of the entire case. No ransom demands, no confirmed sightings, no evidence of violence, nothing. It was as if Paula Weldon had stepped into the forest and simply dissolved into it. Then people began noticing another detail. The disappearances around Glastenbury Mountain seemed to follow no clear pattern. The victims were different ages, different backgrounds, different experience levels outdoors, and yet somehow they kept vanishing in roughly the same region. That realization changed the atmosphere around the mountain completely. What once felt like coincidence was beginning to feel like something else. Something people struggled to explain rationally. And before long, another person would disappear near Bennington. This time, the victim was a child. As the search entered its second week, pressure on investigators intensified across Vermont. Hundreds of volunteers had already searched enormous sections of wilderness surrounding Glastenbury Mountain. And still, there was nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign Paula Weldon had ever left the trail at all. The case quickly exposed a major problem. At the time, Vermont did not even have a statewide police force capable of handling investigations this large. Local authorities were overwhelmed almost immediately. Jurisdiction became confusing. Communication between agencies broke down. And reporters began openly criticizing the search effort in newspapers across the region. Paula's father soon arrived from Connecticut, and according to multiple accounts, he was furious. He believed the investigation lacked coordination and urgency. At one point, he reportedly contacted the governor directly, demanding more resources be deployed into the mountains. Meanwhile, rumors spread everywhere. Some people believed Paula had become disoriented in the wilderness and died from exposure. Others suspected foul play. A few even suggested she had staged her own disappearance intentionally. But investigators struggled to support any theory completely, because every explanation seemed to collide with the same problem. There was no evidence. Search aircraft flew over the mountains, looking for disturbances in the terrain. Crews searched abandoned logging roads buried deep in the forest. College students joined volunteer lines and walked through freezing woods for hours at a time. Still, nothing appeared, and gradually, something unsettling began happening around Bennington. People stopped talking about the disappearance like it was temporary. At first, conversations sounded hopeful. She'll turn up. Maybe she's injured somewhere. They'll find her soon. But as the days passed, that optimism faded. Because people remembered Midi Rivers, and now another person had vanished near the same mountain, without explanation. Some locals quietly started avoiding certain trails entirely, especially near Glastenbury. Not because they believed the forest was cursed, at least not openly, but because the mountain no longer felt ordinary. It felt unpredictable, as though people could enter those woods normally and simply fail to come back out. By late December, Paula Weldon's disappearance had become one of the biggest stories in the country. Newspapers from New York to Chicago carried updates about the missing college student in the red coat. And with every passing day, the mystery only deepened. Investigators continued receiving reported sightings from across the Northeast. Some people claimed Paula had been seen boarding buses. Others insisted they saw her walking along remote roads in nearby states. One witness even believed she was hiding in Massachusetts, under a different name. But none of the reports could ever be confirmed. Meanwhile, search teams kept returning to the mountain. Even after weeks of failure, many volunteers refused to give up completely, because emotionally, the case felt impossible to accept. An 18-year-old student could not simply vanish in broad daylight without leaving behind some kind of trace. At least that's what people wanted to believe. But winter conditions were becoming increasingly dangerous. Snow began covering sections of trail. Ice formed along steep ridges and wooded slopes. And as the weather worsened, the chances of finding Paula alive dropped sharply. Eventually, organized searches started slowing down. Not because people stopped caring, but because investigators were running out of places to look. The mountain had already consumed thousands of search hours. And still, it remained silent. For many residents around Bennington, that silence became the most disturbing part of the entire case. No ransom demands. No confirmed sightings. No evidence of violence. Nothing. It was as if Paula Weldon had stepped into the forest and simply dissolved into it. Then people began noticing another detail. The disappearances around Glastenbury Mountain seemed to follow no clear pattern. The victims were different ages, different backgrounds, different experience levels outdoors, and yet somehow they kept vanishing in roughly the same region. That realization changed the atmosphere around the mountain completely. What once felt like coincidence was beginning to feel like something else, something people struggled to explain rationally. And before long, another person would disappear near Bennington. This time, the victim was a child. In October of 1950, an 8-year-old boy named Paul Jepson disappeared near Bennington, Vermont. Unlike the earlier cases, Paul did not vanish deep in the wilderness during a long hike. He disappeared much closer to home. And somehow, that made the case feel even more frightening. Paul lived with his family on a small farm not far from the mountains. People described him as energetic, curious, and unusually comfortable outdoors for his age. According to family members, he loved being outside and often wandered around the property, exploring nearby fields and wooded areas. On the afternoon of October 12th, Paul's mother left him briefly in the care of animals near the family truck while she completed chores nearby. She was gone only a short time. Some accounts say less than an hour. But when she returned, Paul was gone. At first, nobody assumed the worst. The family believed he had probably wandered off somewhere around the farm. So relatives and neighbors immediately began searching the surrounding area, calling out his name across fields and dirt roads. But very quickly, the situation became alarming. Paul wasn't answering. And despite searching nearby woods and trails repeatedly, nobody could find even the smallest sign of where he had gone. Authorities soon joined the search. Volunteers spread across the countryside, while tracking dogs attempted to pick up Paul's scent near the property. For a time, the dogs appeared to follow a trail leading toward the mountains. Then suddenly, the scent disappeared completely. That detail immediately unsettled local residents. Because by 1950, people around Bennington already knew the stories. Mitty Rivers, Paula Weldon, and now an 8-year-old child missing near the same region. As news spread, fear moved quickly through the community. Parents warned children to stay close to home. Some residents began locking doors at night that they previously never bothered securing. And once again, people started talking quietly about Glastenbury Mountain. Not openly, not dramatically, but carefully, as though speaking about the place too directly somehow felt unwise. Then another strange detail surfaced. According to Paul's mother, the boy had recently become fascinated with stories about the mountain, and more than once, he had talked about wanting to go there himself. The search for Paul Jepson quickly became one of the largest operations the region had ever seen. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns. Police officers searched wooded trails and abandoned logging roads. Farmers rode horseback through rough terrain surrounding the mountains. Everyone hoped the same thing, that Paul was still alive somewhere nearby. But the landscape around Bennington made searching incredibly difficult. Dense woods stretched for miles in every direction. Certain sections of forest were steep, tangled, and nearly impossible to navigate quickly. And as autumn deepened, colder weather moved steadily into the region. Searchers focused heavily on the idea that Paul may have wandered toward Glastenbury Mountain, partly because of the direction the tracking dogs initially followed, but also because many locals believed the mountain had become strangely connected to disappearances in the area. Even people who rejected supernatural explanations admitted the pattern was difficult to ignore. Investigators questioned neighbors, checked nearby roads, and interviewed anyone who might have seen Paul that afternoon. Some reports claimed a strange car had been spotted near the area around the time of the disappearance. Others believed the boy had simply become lost in the wilderness. But like the earlier cases, every theory eventually collided with the same problem. Evidence was almost non-existent. Days passed, then weeks, and gradually, the optimism surrounding the search began fading. For Paul's family, the uncertainty was devastating. No parent wants to imagine a child alone in the mountains after dark, especially in terrain where adults themselves could easily become disoriented. And yet, despite enormous search efforts, there was still no confirmed trace of him anywhere. Over time, people around Bennington began speaking about the disappearances differently. At first, the cases had seemed tragic but isolated. Now they felt connected, not officially, not scientifically, but emotionally, because each new disappearance reinforced the same unsettling idea. People entered the region around Glastenbury Mountain, and sometimes they never returned. And before the fear surrounding the mountain had time to fade, another impossible disappearance would push the mystery even further. This time, the person would vanish from a moving bus. Just 16 days after Paul Jepson disappeared, another person vanished near Glastenbury Mountain. Her name was Frida Langer, and unlike the earlier cases, this disappearance came with witnesses. Frida was 53 years old and experienced outdoors. She lived in the area with her husband and was familiar with the trails surrounding Somerset Reservoir and the wooded regions near Glastenbury. On October 28, 1950, she joined several relatives for a camping and hiking trip in the mountains. According to everyone with her, the day began completely normally. At some point during the hike, Frida slipped while crossing a stream and fell into the water. She wasn't seriously injured, but her clothes became soaked from the freezing current. Wanting to change quickly before temperatures dropped further, Frida told the others she planned to return alone to the family camp, a short distance away. The decision seemed harmless at the time. The route back was familiar. The camp was nearby, and Frida was more than capable of navigating the terrain herself. So the group separated temporarily, expecting to see her again shortly. But she never arrived. At first, her relatives assumed she had taken a different path through the woods. Then they assumed perhaps she had gotten delayed changing clothes. But as time passed, and the light began fading from the mountains, concern turned into panic. Search teams moved into the area almost immediately. And unlike some of the earlier disappearances, investigators believed this case should have been solvable. Frida had vanished during daylight hours. People knew approximately where she had last been seen, and the distance between the stream and the campsite was relatively short. Yet somehow, searchers found nothing. No footprints clearly leading away. No damaged brush. No cries for help. Nothing. The case deeply disturbed experienced outdoorsmen involved in the search, because the terrain around the stream was difficult, but not impossible. An experienced hiker should not have vanished completely within such a limited area, especially not while other people were nearby. And as another large-scale search unfolded around Glastenbury Mountain, many locals began wondering the same thing. How many disappearances could happen near the same mountain before coincidence stopped feeling believable? The search for Frida Langer continued for days, then weeks, and eventually, it became one of the most extensive wilderness searches Vermont had ever conducted at the time. Hundreds of volunteers moved through the mountains surrounding Somerset Reservoir. Search aircraft scanned sections of forest from above. Boats checked nearby waterways. Investigators revisited trails repeatedly, convinced they must have overlooked something important. Because unlike earlier disappearances, this one seemed impossible to explain through simple geography alone. Frida had not been deep in unknown wilderness. She had been relatively close to camp, close enough that returning alone should have taken only a short amount of time. And yet somehow, she vanished completely between two known locations. That detail deeply unsettled searchers, especially those familiar with outdoor survival, because getting lost was one thing, but disappearing without leaving evidence inside such a contained area felt different. As the investigation expanded, theories multiplied quickly. Some believed Frida suffered a medical emergency in the woods, and collapsed somewhere hidden beneath thick terrain. Others suspected foul play, and inevitably, some residents connected her disappearance to the growing legend surrounding Glastenbury Mountain. By then, newspapers had already begun using phrases like the vanishings when discussing the region. People outside Vermont became fascinated by the story, and inside Bennington, fear quietly continued building. Then, several months later, something happened that transformed Frida's case completely. In May of 1951, after snow melted across sections of the mountain, Frida Langer's body was finally discovered in the woods. But the discovery only created more questions. Because according to reports, the location where her remains were found had supposedly already been searched multiple times during earlier operations. Investigators struggled to explain how search teams could have missed a body in that area repeatedly. Unfortunately, the condition of the remains made determining an exact cause of death extremely difficult, and without clear forensic evidence, authorities could not conclusively explain what had happened to her. That uncertainty became part of the legend, because even though Frida was eventually found, her case still felt unresolved. And for many people around Bennington, the mountain itself remained the central mystery. By the early 1950s, locals had started calling the area something new, a name that would survive for decades afterward: the Bennington Triangle. By the time the phrase Bennington Triangle entered public conversation, the disappearances had already taken on a life of their own, not just as criminal investigations, but as folklore. People began comparing the region to other mysterious locations around the world, places where strange events seemed to cluster without explanation. And over time, the stories surrounding Glastenbury Mountain only became more exaggerated. Some claimed the forest was cursed. Others believed unusual magnetic forces existed in the area. There were stories about strange lights moving through the trees at night. Hunters talked about sudden silence in the woods, where birds and insects stopped making noise completely. A few even claimed they experienced the unsettling feeling of being watched while hiking alone. Of course, none of those stories proved anything, and many investigators strongly pushed back against supernatural explanations. Because wilderness disappearances, while tragic, were not impossible to explain rationally. The terrain around Glastenbury Mountain was genuinely dangerous. The forests were dense and disorienting. Weather conditions changed rapidly, and before modern navigation technology, becoming lost in remote wilderness could quickly become fatal, especially during cold weather months. Still, the concentration of disappearances inside one region continued bothering people, particularly because the victims seemed so different from one another. A seasoned hunting guide, a college student, a child, an experienced hiker. There was no obvious connection tying them together beyond geography itself. And perhaps that was what made the mystery endure for so long. The lack of a satisfying explanation. Over the years, investigators, writers, and researchers proposed countless theories. Serial predators, hidden accidents in remote terrain, psychological panic leading people off trail. Even the possibility that some disappearances had nothing to do with one another at all. But none of the theories fully solved every case. And because of that, the mountain continued holding its reputation, quietly, persistently, like a question nobody could answer completely. Even today, hikers still travel through the trails around Glastenbury. Most return without incident. Some describe the area as beautiful. Others call it unsettling, and a few say the forest feels strangely empty once you move deep enough into it. But whether the Bennington Triangle is truly mysterious, or simply a collection of tragedies shaped into legend over time, depends entirely on who you ask. As the years passed, the disappearances around Glastenbury Mountain slowly transformed from local tragedies into something much larger, a regional legend. People started telling the stories together instead of separately. Not the Paula Weldon case. Not the Midi River's disappearance. But one connected mystery tied to a single stretch of wilderness in southern Vermont. And once that happened, the mountain itself became the focus. Writers began collecting stories from hunters, hikers, and longtime residents around Bennington. Some accounts were ordinary, others were difficult to explain, at least emotionally. A few hikers described suddenly losing all sense of direction while walking familiar trails. Some claimed the forest became unnaturally quiet without warning. No birds, no wind, no insects, just silence. Others spoke about strange sounds echoing through the trees at night. Distant whistles, footsteps, voices that seemed too far away to identify clearly. And while most of those experiences could probably be explained naturally, they still contributed to the growing atmosphere surrounding the mountain. Because fear changes the way people interpret ordinary things. A shifting shadow feels different once you know someone disappeared nearby. Silence feels heavier. The woods feel deeper. Over time, even experienced outdoorsmen admitted there was something psychologically unsettling about Glastenbury. Not necessarily supernatural, but isolating. The terrain could make people feel small very quickly. Large sections of the mountain remained undeveloped and difficult to access. Old logging roads vanished into dense forest. Certain abandoned settlements nearby had slowly emptied over the decades, leaving behind collapsing structures reclaimed by wilderness. And during colder months, fog and early darkness could make the area feel almost disorienting, especially alone. The atmosphere became central to the legend, because unlike many mysteries, the Bennington Triangle never offered closure. No dramatic confession, no clear explanation tying everything together. Just unanswered disappearances spread across years of silence. And maybe that uncertainty was exactly why the story endured, because people naturally search for patterns, especially when random tragedy feels emotionally unacceptable. So gradually, the mountain stopped becoming just a place and started becoming an idea. Despite decades of speculation, investigators have never found evidence proving the disappearances around Glastenbury Mountain were connected by a single cause. And that distinction matters, because over time, the legend surrounding the Bennington Triangle became so large that separating fact from folklore grew increasingly difficult. Some researchers argued the cases were simply tragic wilderness accidents grouped together by public imagination. After all, forests can be unforgiving. People panic. They become disoriented. Bad weather erases evidence quickly. And once fear enters the equation, even experienced outdoorsmen can make catastrophic decisions. Others believed at least some of the disappearances involved foul play. A predator operating in isolated terrain. Someone capable of moving through the region unnoticed. The theory was never proven, but it persisted for years because of one uncomfortable reality. Several victims vanished without leaving behind the kind of evidence investigators normally expected to find. Then there were the paranormal explanations, stories about curses, strange energy fields, even rumors involving creatures supposedly seen in remote sections of the mountain. Most serious investigators dismissed those theories entirely. Still, the stories spread anyway, because mysteries tend to attract mythology, especially when the truth remains incomplete. And perhaps that is what makes the Bennington Triangle endure even now. Not the idea that something supernatural lives in the woods, but the unsettling possibility that ordinary people can disappear under ordinary circumstances and leave almost nothing behind. The wilderness has always carried that kind of quiet danger. A single wrong turn, a sudden storm, a moment of panic. And the deeper someone moves into isolated terrain, the harder they become to find. Maybe Glastenbury Mountain was never cursed. Maybe the disappearances were unrelated tragedies shaped together over time by fear, coincidence, and human storytelling. That explanation is entirely possible. But even today, locals around Bennington still speak carefully about those woods. Not dramatically. Not like characters in a horror movie. More like people respecting something they do not fully understand. And once the sun begins disappearing behind the trees out there, it becomes easy to understand why. Today, the forests surrounding Glastenbury Mountain look peaceful. Tourists hike sections of the long trail every year. Photographers visit during autumn when the leaves turn deep shades of orange and red. And for most people, the mountains around Bennington feel quiet, beautiful, and completely ordinary, which is perhaps the strangest part of the entire story. Because places connected to fear in popular culture often appear dramatic. Dark castles, deserted buildings, storm-covered landscapes. But Glastenbury does not look like that. It looks normal, and maybe that is exactly why the disappearances continue haunting people decades later. Because there is no obvious explanation waiting in the trees. No confirmed killer. No final revelation. No moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Instead, there are only fragments. A hunting guide who vanished while leading others through familiar woods. A college student in a red coat who never came home. A child who disappeared near his family farm. An experienced hiker who somehow vanished walking back to camp. Individually, each case might be explainable. People disappear in wilderness areas every year. Searches fail. Evidence gets lost. Nature hides things surprisingly well. Investigators understand that. But together, the stories create something heavier. A pattern people feel emotionally, even when they cannot fully prove it logically. And perhaps that feeling is what transformed a remote stretch of Vermont wilderness into one of America's most enduring mysteries. Over the years, countless visitors have entered those woods, hoping to solve the legend for themselves. Most leave disappointed, because Glastenbury Mountain does not offer answers easily. Only atmosphere, silence, and the uncomfortable awareness of how quickly a person can vanish once they are truly alone in the wilderness. Maybe there was never anything supernatural hiding in the Bennington Triangle. Maybe the real horror was always something much more ordinary. Isolation, weather, fear. The sheer size of the natural world compared to a single human being. Because out there, it does not take much to disappear. In many ways, the Bennington Triangle remains unsolved for a simple reason. There was never enough evidence. Not enough to prove a serial predator operated in the mountains. Not enough to support paranormal theories. And not enough to fully explain why several people disappeared under such different circumstances within the same region. That uncertainty allowed the story to survive across generations. Because unanswered mysteries tend to linger longer than solved ones. Especially the quiet mysteries. The kind without dramatic conclusions. Even now, decades later, investigators and researchers still revisit the cases hoping some overlooked detail might finally connect everything together. A missed witness statement. An old document. A forgotten search report. But so far, nothing definitive has emerged. And perhaps that is why the story continues resonating with people who hear it for the first time. Not because it feels impossible, but because it feels possible enough to be real. Anyone can imagine themselves in those situations. Walking a trail as daylight fades. Taking a wrong turn in unfamiliar woods. Becoming separated from others for only a few minutes. Most people assume they would find their way back easily, until they realize how quickly wilderness changes after dark. The forests around Glastenbury are still there. The trails remain open. And every year, hikers continue moving through the same mountains where these disappearances occurred generations ago. Most experience nothing unusual, just wind through the trees, cold air, and long stretches of silence. But every so often, someone new discovers the story of the Bennington Triangle for the first time. And once they do, the woods tend to feel a little different afterward. A little deeper. a little quieter. Because somewhere in those mountains are the final moments of people who never made it home. Moments nobody witnessed. Moments the forest kept for itself. And maybe that is why the mystery still endures. Not because people are certain something happened there, but because nobody can say for sure that nothing did. Long after the headlines faded, the disappearances around Glastenbury Mountain remained part of the landscape. Not officially. There are no warning signs telling people to stay away from the forest. No barriers blocking the trails. And during daylight hours, the mountains often appear calm enough to erase the stories completely. But locals remember, especially older residents around Bennington. Some grew up hearing about Paula Weldon before they were old enough to understand the case itself. Others remember relatives speaking quietly about search parties moving through the woods late at night with lanterns and dogs. And over time, the mystery settled into local memory almost like weather, always there in the background. Because unlike many famous mysteries, the Bennington Triangle never ended with certainty. There was no courtroom conclusion, no confession years later, no final discovery that explained everything cleanly. Just scattered disappearances connected by geography and by silence. Maybe that silence encouraged people to imagine something larger hiding behind the cases. Human beings naturally dislike unfinished stories. We search for patterns, for causes, for meaning, especially when tragedy feels random. But sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that resist becoming neat narratives. The ones where every explanation feels incomplete. Perhaps Glastenbury Mountain was simply dangerous terrain shaped into folklore through coincidence and fear. That is entirely possible. In fact, many investigators believe exactly that. And yet, on cold evenings when fog settles into the trees and daylight disappears early across the trails, the mountain still carries a certain atmosphere difficult to describe. Not evil. Not supernatural. Just indifferent. The wilderness does not care how experienced someone is. It does not care whether a person is cautious, intelligent, or familiar with the terrain. And once someone becomes isolated out there, the distance between ordinary life and disaster can become surprisingly small. Maybe that is the real story behind the Bennington Triangle. Not a curse. Not monsters. Not ghosts hidden in the forest. But the unsettling realization that sometimes people vanish, and the world never fully explains why.